Hades first saw her through a wound in the earth. Far above his silent kingdom, Persephone moved through the fields with the sunlight on her skin and the scent of rain-soaked flowers around her. The other maidens gathered blossoms beneath the open sky, laughing as they filled their arms with violets, roses, and soft narcissus. But Persephone kept wandering ahead. She was drawn to the edges of the meadow, to the places where the grass grew taller, where the trees stood closer together, and where the light began to thin. The meadow was beautiful, but every path in it felt familiar. Every hill led back to the same place. Every shadow had been turned into a warning. Demeter watched from afar. She loved her daughter more than anything the earth could grow, and because she loved her, she kept her close. Persephone could walk beneath the sun, but never beyond the reach of Demeter's gaze. And slowly, Persephone began to understand the shape of her own cage. Only as a quiet pressure around her life, a sense that the fields were not the edge of the world, and that something beyond them had been kept from her. From below, Hades watched. He had seen souls enter his kingdom in fear, in grief, in silence. But Persephone was different. She was alive in a way the underworld had never known. Flowers answered her steps. Light seemed to linger where she stood. Even the shadows near her appeared to lean closer, as if they wanted to understand her warmth. At first, Hades told himself he was only observing the world above. But each day, his gaze returned to the same meadow, to the same young goddess who drifted toward the places others avoided, to the same restless eyes that did not belong completely to the spring. Then, one morning, Persephone stopped at the edge of the field. The maidens called for her, but she did not answer. Beneath the flowers, the ground trembled faintly, too softly for the others to notice. But Persephone felt it, and so did Hades. For a moment, the world above and the kingdom below seemed to listen to each other. Then Persephone placed her hand against the earth. Hades leaned forward from his throne, and in that silence, the god of the dead made his choice. Watching would never be enough. He wanted her beside him. Hades did not act on impulse. To take the daughter of Demeter was no simple desire. It was an act that could shake the order of the gods and turn the living world against him. So Hades ascended, not to the surface, but to Olympus, seeking Zeus, king of the gods, the only power capable of granting what Demeter would never surrender. Zeus received him without surprise. Nothing moved among gods without reaching Olympus in one form or another, and the desire of Hades had not remained hidden for long. The lord of the underworld stood before his brother and spoke as a king whose realm had waited too long without a queen. He did not ask for Persephone as a passing desire or as a stolen pleasure, but as the goddess who would sit beside him in the dark and give the throne of the dead a power it had never possessed. Zeus listened. He knew Demeter would refuse, that she would never place her daughter willingly in the arms of the underworld. He knew that if Persephone vanished, the earth itself might suffer for it. But Zeus was not moved by fear. To him, the request was not only desire, it was order. A kingdom without a queen was incomplete, and Hades, though feared, was still a ruler whose realm touched every life that would ever end. So Zeus gave what Demeter would never give, his consent. The decision passed between the brothers in silence. And far below Olympus, Persephone had no idea her life was about to change forever. But even with Zeus beside him, Hades could not simply appear before Demeter's daughter and command her into the dark. Persephone was guarded by light, by maidens, and by the careful boundaries her mother had built around her life. So the gods prepared a lure. Not a weapon, not a chain, a flower. From the deep earth, a narcissus rose unlike any bloom the world had ever seen. Its petals opened with impossible beauty, bright enough to draw the eye from every other color in the meadow. It stood alone, silent and perfect, as if it had been grown for one hand only, for Persephone. That morning, she walked again through the fields with the maidens beside her. They gathered violets, roses, crocuses, and soft narcissus flowers beneath the open sun, unaware that one bloom among them had been placed there by divine will. Demeter was not with them. For once, her watchful presence had pulled away, trusting the meadow, trusting the maidens, trusting the world she believed she had made safe. But the meadow was no longer safe. Persephone saw the flower from a distance. Everything around it seemed ordinary. The grass, the wind, the warmth of the morning. But the narcissus did not belong with the rest. It was more beautiful than any flower Persephone had ever seen, bright enough to pull her gaze away from every other color in the meadow. It stood beyond the others, near the edge of the field, where the earth grew darker and the roots twisted closer to the surface. The maidens continued gathering blossoms behind her, and Persephone stepped away without anyone stopping her. She moved toward the flower as if drawn by something more than curiosity. The closer she came, the quieter the meadow became. The birds fell silent, the wind faded, and the laughter of the maidens slipped farther behind her. Below, Hades waited. His black horses shifted in the dark beneath the soil. His chariot stood ready. The god of the dead had the word of Zeus, the silence of the meadow, and the flower made to lead Persephone to him. She knelt before the narcissus, and for a moment, she only looked at it. Then she reached out. Her fingers closed around the stem, and beneath her hand, the earth began to break. The meadow split beneath Persephone's hand. At first, it was only a crack, thin and dark, beneath the roots of the narcissus. Then, the ground groaned. The flowers bent backward, and the quiet field began to tear apart, as if something buried beneath the world had finally awakened. Persephone pulled away, but the earth had already opened. The maidens screamed behind her. Their baskets fell, scattering violets and roses across the grass. The sunlight trembled over the field, and from the widening darkness came the sound of hooves striking stone. Then Hades appeared. He rose from the depths in a chariot black as buried stone, drawn by immortal horses whose breath rolled like smoke through the broken earth. His presence carried the cold weight of the underworld, dark, solemn, and terrifying. Yet there was nothing wild in him. He had the stillness of a king who did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. For a moment, Persephone could not move. The god before her was not like the bright gods of Olympus. There was no golden laughter in him, no warmth, no easy beauty made for temples and songs. Hades carried the silence of everything buried beneath the earth, and it moved with him as he reached for her. Persephone cried out. She called to the maidens, to the sky, to her mother. But Demeter was far away, and Zeus, who heard from Olympus, did not answer. Hades took her into the chariot. The horses reared, the ground shook, and the meadow that had once felt like a cage now became the last piece of the world Persephone knew. She saw the flowers, the frightened faces of the maidens, the open sky above her, and for the first time in her life, she wanted nothing more than to remain beneath it. But the chariot turned toward the darkness. The earth closed above them. Light vanished, and the descent began. Persephone clutched the edge of the chariot as the world of the living disappeared behind her. The air changed first. The warmth of spring was gone, replaced by a cold stillness that moved over her skin and entered her breath. The scent of flowers faded until only stone, smoke, and ancient water remained. Above her, the meadow had sealed itself as if nothing had happened. Below, the road of the dead opened. Hades stood beside her, holding the reins, his eyes fixed forward into the dark. He had claimed what Zeus had granted him, yet the silence between them did not feel like victory. Persephone's fear filled the chariot more powerfully than any scream. She looked at him with anger, terror, and disbelief. Hades did not look away. He had watched her from below for days, imagining the moment she would enter his kingdom. But no vision had prepared him for the silence beside her, heavy with the world he had taken away. Still, he did not turn back. The horses carried them deeper, past walls of black stone and rivers that moved without sunlight. Shadows gathered along the path, not attacking, not speaking, only watching as their king brought a living goddess into the realm of the dead. Persephone saw them, the souls, thousands of them. Faces pale as mist, hands reaching from the darkness. Eyes following her with a hunger that was not for flesh, but for the warmth she carried. She pressed herself away from them, and the flowers still tangled in her hair began to wilt. Hades noticed. For the first time, something like doubt moved across his face. He had wanted her beside him. He had wanted spring in the halls of the dead, but the underworld did not welcome life gently. It watched her. It tested her. It began to change the air around her before she had even reached its gates. At last, the chariot slowed before a palace carved into the darkness itself. It was a kingdom, ancient and immense, built for a god who had ruled alone for too long. Hades stepped down first. Then he turned to Persephone. For the first time, she stood at the edge of the world that would become her prison, her trial, and one day, her throne. She looked back toward the road they had taken, but there was no meadow behind her now. There was only darkness. Then she turned and found Hades waiting for her to enter. Persephone did not enter the palace. She was swallowed by it. The doors were a mouth of black stone, closing around the last traces of sunlight still clinging to her skin. Inside, the air did not move. It carried no scent of rain, no warmth of grass, no hum of bees beneath the morning sky. It tasted of ancient dust, cold iron, and stone that had never known spring. She stood in the center of a hall built for eternity, her breathing the only living rhythm in a world of stillness. Hades did not approach her. He remained near the shadows of his throne, watching the goddess of spring fade beneath the weight of his kingdom. For ages, he had imagined her there. He had imagined light in the halls of the dead, warmth beside his throne, life finally entering the realm that every living thing feared. But he had not imagined what that light would become once trapped in darkness. Persephone looked at the second throne, a seat that had been prepared for her. It was not a gift, it was a cage shaped like a chair. That was the moment her fear began to change, because fear could not survive forever in a place that offered no mercy. In the cold of the underworld, Persephone's heart hardened into anger. Zeus had given his consent, Hades told her, as if the will of another god could make her silence into surrender. The word struck harder than the darkness. Zeus had known. The king of the gods, her own father, had allowed it. To them, she had not been a daughter, not a goddess, not a life with a will of her own. She had been something to give, something to trade, something to place between kingdoms and call order. Persephone looked at Hades then, beginning to understand that no one had asked what she wanted, because no one had believed her will mattered. Food and water were brought to her, along with silk dark enough to belong to the palace itself. But Persephone left everything untouched. She remained in the center of the hall, silent and unbroken, while the dead gathered at the edges of the dark. They did not speak. They did not reach for her. They only watched, drawn to the warmth she carried like souls remembering the sun. And then Persephone understood why Hades had wanted her. He had not wanted only her beauty. He had wanted the life that moved through her, the spring that followed her steps, the comfort of something living beside the throne of death. But Persephone would not become the answer to his loneliness. If the underworld expected her to kneel, it had misunderstood her completely. She had been taken from the meadow, but something inside her had not been conquered. And as she looked into the endless dark, Persephone made a silent vow. If this realm was to call her queen, it would one day learn to fear the crown it placed upon her. For a moment, the meadow remained still. The grass settled back over the broken ground. The flowers lifted their heads again beneath the sun. The wind returned softly through the trees, carrying the scent of violets, roses, and the narcissus that no longer stood where Persephone had touched it. But Persephone was gone. The maiden stood frozen among the scattered flowers, unable to understand what they had seen. One moment she had been there, kneeling before the strange bloom. The next, the earth had opened, the black chariot had risen, and the daughter of Demeter had vanished beneath the world. Then the screams began. They called her name across the meadow, but the earth gave no answer. The ground had sealed shut, leaving only trampled flowers and silence, where Persephone had disappeared. Demeter had heard Persephone's cry before she reached the meadow. It had torn across the fields like something living, sharp enough to make the grain bend and the birds scatter from the trees. She knew her daughter's voice. She knew fear inside it. By the time she arrived, Persephone was gone. The maidens stood among the scattered flowers, pale and trembling, their baskets fallen open at their feet. None of them moved. None of them spoke. Whatever they had seen had left terror in their eyes, but the shock of it held them silent. Demeter looked from one face to another. She asked where Persephone was. No one answered. She asked again, and this time the meadow itself seemed to tighten around her voice. Still, the maidens said nothing. So she searched, first among the scattered flowers, then through the trampled grass, then around the place where the strange narcissus had stood. She found crushed blossoms, torn roots, and disturbed earth. But no path led away from the field. No sign told her where Persephone had gone. So Demeter carried her grief beyond the meadow. She crossed fields, mountains, rivers, and cities with a torch in each hand, calling Persephone's name through the night. She did not eat. She did not rest. She did not return to Olympus. The gods heard her grief and kept their distance, because there was something terrible in the sorrow of a goddess who had given the world its harvest and now felt the world had taken everything from her. For 9 days, Demeter wandered, and with every day that passed, Demeter's grief sank deeper into the earth. The grass began to lose its color. Leaves curled before their time. Flowers closed as if the sun no longer knew how to reach them. But every day Persephone remained missing. The living world moved closer to hunger. And still, Demeter searched. Until at last, in the darkness before dawn, another goddess came to her. Hecate, who had heard Persephone's cry from her cave, approached with a torch in her hand. She had not seen the face of the one who took her, but she had heard the girl's voice as it vanished beneath the earth. That was enough. Together, Demeter and Hecate went to the one god who had seen everything from above. Helios, the sun, who looked down upon gods and mortals alike. And when Demeter stood before him, hollow with grief and burning with rage, Helios could not hide the truth from her. Persephone had not been lost. She had been taken from the meadow. Zeus had allowed it, and Hades had taken her away. The flower had not been an accident. It had been the beginning of a plan made to steal her daughter from the world. For a moment, Demeter froze as the truth settled over her. Her daughter had been stolen by Hades, but the betrayal had come from Zeus. Demeter did not weep. She did not scream. She simply turned her back on Olympus, and as she walked away, the world began to freeze. The freezing did not come like a storm. It came quietly. First, the birds stopped singing. Then, the insects fell still. The soil hardened beneath the fields, and seeds that should have opened remained buried in the dark. Demeter did not curse the heavens. She simply turned away. And the earth, which had always followed her, began to lose its warmth. Demeter decided that if her daughter had been taken from the world, then the world would feel what it meant to lose her. So the cold spread farther. Olympus felt it too. As the world below starved, the offerings that fed the glory of the gods began to disappear. Only then did Zeus understand what Demeter's grief could become. He had traded his daughter's happiness for his brother's desire, but he had forgotten one truth. A world that cannot eat is a world that will not worship. Below, in the hollow halls of Hades, the underworld began to change. It had always received the dead, but now the famine above was sending them before their time. Souls arrived carrying the memory of gray fields and prayers that had gone unanswered. They brought the cold of the dying earth with them, a coldness that even the fires of Tartarus could not warm. Persephone watched them pass. She saw children with hollow cheeks, farmers with broken hands, mothers who had died still thinking of the mouths they could not feed. And then she understood. Her absence was not only a wound in her mother's heart, it was a wound that spread through every living thing. Then Persephone broke her silence for the first time and turned to Hades with a cold and terrifying clarity.
You wanted a queen, but look at what you have done. You have not brought spring into the darkness. You have brought the darkness into spring.
Hades looked at her. He saw the wilted flowers in her hair and the growing power in her gaze. He had spent eternity in darkness, and in his desperation for light, he had begun to destroy the only warmth he had ever loved. But the king of the dead did not know how to let go. While Zeus measured the cost of his betrayal and Hades held on to what he had taken, Demeter stood at the edge of a dying forest. She no longer cared for the prayers of mortals, their hunger, or even the survival of the gods. If her daughter was to remain in the dark, then the whole world would follow her there. The great frost had begun. Persephone had stopped fighting the palace, but she had not accepted it. There were no more desperate steps toward gates that would not open. The first shock had burned away, leaving something colder behind. Persephone moved through the halls of Hades' palace in dead silence. Hades noticed the change, and it unsettled him. He had expected fear to fade. He had expected anger to remain. But Persephone had become harder to read. She no longer looked only like the girl he had taken from the meadow. The underworld was changing her in ways he had not foreseen. The dead turned when she passed, not because she commanded them, but because the warmth she carried stirred something even death had not erased. Persephone felt it too, though she hated that she did. The realm below was still cold, but it was no longer empty to her. Behind every shadow there was a memory. Behind every silence, there was someone who had once breathed, loved, feared, and lost. That was the first thing the underworld took from her. The comfort of believing it was only darkness. Hades tried to explain why he had brought her to the underworld, but Persephone did not need his excuses. She had already begun to understand what he had never been able to explain. The dead were not simply his subjects. They were all that remained of lives once loved, once feared, once torn from the world above. And they looked at her as if she might become something more than Hades had intended. That frightened him, because Persephone's power was not growing from obedience. It was growing from refusal. Zeus had waited until the world above was close to breaking. The fields had failed. The prayers had thinned, and Demeter's grief had become too dangerous to ignore. At last, the king of the gods sent Hermes into the underworld with a message. Persephone was to be returned. The command moved through the palace like a blade. For the first time since her arrival, Persephone felt the world above reach for her. The thought of sunlight struck her so sharply she almost forgot to breathe. She saw the meadow in her mind, the open sky, her mother's face, the life she had believed was gone forever. Hades saw it too. He saw hope return to her before she could hide it, and something in him tightened. He had brought her into the dark because he could not bear the emptiness of his kingdom. But now, Olympus had commanded her return, and the world above was threatening to take her from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Persephone should have felt relief. She saw the meadow in her mind, but the underworld had already marked her. Not with love, not with surrender, with something darker. The realization that a part of her had answered to this place before she ever understood why. That frightened her almost as much as Hades had. Hades turned toward the table where the food she had refused still remained untouched. Among the dark bread and cold water sat a fruit Persephone had not noticed before, its skin deep red beneath the pale fire. A pomegranate. Hades looked at the fruit, then at Persephone. He understood now that force could bring her below, but it could not make her stay. Hades did not command her. He did not beg. He simply stepped back, leaving the pomegranate between her and the light, a fruit of blood in a house of stone. The world above was calling, but the silence of the underworld was louder. Persephone stood before the pomegranate. In the pale fire of the palace, the fruit did not look like food. It looked like a beating heart, red and heavy with the secrets of the deep earth. Hades remained in the shadows. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply waited, knowing that some chains are not made of iron, but of choice and desire. Persephone reached out. Her fingers brushed the skin of the fruit. It was cold, yet it carried the memory of the sun that had grown it. She knew the law. To taste the food of the dead was to belong to the dead. She looked toward the gates, then back at the red fruit. In that moment, she was not only choosing between her mother and Hades. She was choosing between the girl who had been taken from the meadow and the queen the darkness had begun to awaken. She broke the fruit open. The seeds spilled out like rubies in the dark. 6 of them, 6 drops of liquid fire. For one final breath, she stood between the life she had lost and the fate waiting before her. Then she placed the seeds in her mouth. They tasted of tart wine, ancient earth, and power. As she swallowed, the palace seemed to exhale. The shadows leaned closer. The bond was sealed. Persephone could still return to the world above, but not completely. A part of her now belonged to the underworld. She wiped a stray drop of red from her lip and looked at Hades. For the first time, she did not look away. She had eaten the darkness. Now, she was ready to rule it. Hermes had been sent to carry Persephone back to the light, but when he saw the red stain on her lips, he knew the underworld had already won. The road upward was open, but Persephone was no longer the goddess who had fallen. The pomegranate had done what Zeus could not. It had written a law in her blood. She emerged into a world of bone-white frost, a world that had almost forgotten the sun, where the air carried the bitter scent of hunger beneath a mother's grief. Demeter was waiting at the edge of the silence. Their reunion was not only joy. When Demeter held her daughter, she felt the coldness of the underworld still clinging to her skin. Persephone was alive. She had returned, but she was not the same. Persephone had tasted the seeds. She could not be whole again. The pomegranate had bound part of her to the underworld, and neither Hades nor Demeter would surrender their claim. Hades would not release what the fruit had tied to his realm, and Demeter would not yield her daughter to the dark. So Zeus shaped the consequence into law. For every seed she had tasted, Persephone would spend 1 month upon the throne of shadows. 6 seeds she had eaten, 6 months bound to the underworld. And when those months came, Demeter's grief would return with them. This became the heartbeat of the world. When Persephone descends, the earth grieves with its mother. The fields go silent, the trees stand bare, and the world holds its breath in the dark. They called it winter. But when she rises, the earth remembers how to live. Flowers break the soil and the air turns sweet, following the footsteps of a daughter coming home. They called it spring. Persephone became the only bridge between 2 worlds. She is the maiden of the meadow and the queen of the dead. She belongs to the sunlight that raised her and to the darkness that changed her. For as long as the earth turns, life will follow her return, and death will wait for her descent. The cycle is eternal, because even in the deepest winter, the seeds of spring are already waiting for their queen. And so, the world learned to wait for her. Every winter, mortals remember that Persephone has descended once more into the kingdom beneath the earth. But she returns as queen. In the darkness, Hades waits for her, as the king who learned that a queen cannot be made by force. And Persephone, crowned by shadow and remembered by flowers, walks between 2 worlds that need her, yet neither can fully possess her. Above, she is the breath of spring. Below, she is the silence before judgment. She is the daughter Demeter mourns, the queen Hades cannot command, and the goddess Death itself learned to obey. So when winter comes, do not think the world has ended. It is only holding its breath, because somewhere beneath the roots of the earth, Persephone is sitting upon her throne. And when she rises again, even death will have to let the flowers bloom.